I don't think that this one F1 driver can really get full control of his team. At least not yet. Right now, the promise handed to George Russell when he left Williams to go to Mercedes seems to be left wanting. But that doesn't mean that he's going to be going quietly into the night, and I think that this season, especially with the whole GPDA thing, could be the making of one George Russell, with Max Verstappen being a really unexpected partner in crime. 2024 has been quite the mixed bag for George, hasn't it? We're all aware of the situation back at the Belgian Grand Prix, where he was disqualified from probably one of the tensest end portions of a race we had seen this season, with Lewis right up his gearbox, free to race. We might have been able to see George Russell challenge for victory at the Brazilian Grand Prix just gone, because he was really driving the socks off that Mercedes in those conditions, but then we didn't get that when Mercedes played caution to the wind and decided to be cautious. But this was a circuit which clearly appealed to his driving ability if the car was with him, and in these conditions. Heck, he probably would have settled for a second place finish behind Verstappen with that wet prowess of his. But then sadly it wasn't to be, and we ended up with a situation where the current red flag rule just reigned supreme and allowed drivers to make the most of it. But to be fair, it is open to everybody, and according to the likes of Stefano Domenicali, it's not going to be going away, this rule, anytime soon. So I would recommend the Race Fans article that I will link to in the pinned comment if you want to do some deep reading. So for many, people might be thinking that George Russell is on a hiding to nowhere, and he might fade away into obscurity or even out of F1 altogether next year. But then there is of course the matter of the creation of an Instagram account by the Grand Prix Drivers Association, which George Russell is the director of, and is often seen as the figurehead amongst the drivers. Now, when this came about, I was sure to follow this really quickly, because I remember the days of the GPDA being reformed in the early 90s, back when Senna was pushing for this to be reinstated, and of course he was unable to realise the full of it, but then Niki Lauda and Michael Schumacher were able to pick up the slack. And then of course, we were all wondering, well, what's going to be happening? This all came about after the Brazilian Grand Prix, with all the chicanery with the FIA stewards and red flags being called at unexpected times and virtual safety cars. Something was cooking, especially after what went down in Singapore with Max. We thought something was going to be happening, and sure enough, it did. Just yesterday, a statement pointed to some clues, most notably after Charles Leclerc got his fine for swearing in Mexico, albeit later than expected. And even though he didn't receive the same penalty that Max got for the fact that he apologised immediately, he still got a fine for that, and he was also, in his apology, joking about the absurdity of the situation because he was going, oh sorry, oh no, don't give me a penalty. Let's just say that it's a good thing that the FIA is not aware of multi-level satire. I mean, at least for now, and surely the FIA must be aware about the beef between Johnny Herbert and the Verstappen family. It's been going on for decades, because let us not forget, at Benetton, Jos Verstappen was Michael Schumacher's teammate, and then Johnny Herbert replaced him at Benetton. To any situation regarding Max, Johnny should realistically recuse himself from it. But anyway, back to Russell. Even though he himself most likely didn't write the statement, it's very much presented in expert legalese so that it comes across as an articulate yet firm call for transparency, mutual respect, and a balanced approach to governance in Formula One, and yet its tone sounds so professional and sincere, you could be mistaken that George actually did write the thing, because it does its best to try and be fair, and it presents its argument in a way where it can actually cooperate with the FIA, instead of the GPDA basically going, "Oi, you FIA, stop being so unfair and secretive." So it's very, very careful and very, very tippy-toey, whilst also being very strong. But it also comes with some very interesting barbs towards the FIA president, Mohammed Ben Sulayem, regarding his tone and the way he conducts himself and what he chooses to speak out about, not only regarding Formula One, but basically pretty much anything. And also bringing to light that this governing body, which has vowed to never drag politics into motorsport, decides to bring in politics into the motorsport and makes it clear that it's never going to go away. And I definitely think George inspired that part of the statement, talking about tone. Now you better watch your tone, sir, or we're going to have fisticuffs at dawn. Anyway, here's the actual part of the statement, which I found really, really spicy. The GPDA has, on countless occasions, expressed its view that driver monetary fines are not appropriate for our sport. For the past 3 years, we have called upon the FIA president to share the details and strategy regarding how the FIA financial fines are allocated and where the funds are spent. We have also relayed our concerns about the negative image financial fines bring to the sport. We once again request that the FIA president provides financial transparency and direct, open dialogue with us. All stakeholders, FIA, F1, the teams and the GPDA, should jointly determine how and where the money is spent for the benefit of our sport? It's a perfectly reasonable question, and one I've looked around at and found very little information about myself. Put simply, in regards to where fines go ultimately when the FIA chooses to sanction them toward a driver or a team or an entity, we don't really know where it goes. There are pockets of information here or there, and we just really can't get a concrete answer. And all that vagueness does is just make us think, well, yeah, it's going to go into the pockets of the senior management of the FIA, isn't it? For the last few years, there is absolutely zero information where these fines go. So it's only right for them to actually bring up the question and actually make it clear to the world where exactly these fines go. Do they actually help people who are getting into karting when they're just children, and therefore being able to build up the talent pool from multiple and diverse backgrounds that aren't just necessarily rich people or ones with very, very big sponsors? And also just explaining why there is a need to have fines in the first place of this capacity. And according to F1 Big Data, the total so far of fines amassed is actually not that small. It's around $445,000 with 3 races to go, as well as the FIA fining the Austin circuit, the circuit of the Americas, because the track invasion that took place was not through the regulations and could have easily caused some injury. So pushing about $1 million worth of fines there, that's a pretty penny. Oh, and by the way, Lando's in more hot water because he's the one that amassed the biggest fine of the season so far, €50,000 for crossing the track at the Miami Grand Prix, although it's been pushed down to 25,000 if he promises to not be a naughty boy and do it again. But what we do know is that this concerted effort for change and to break a sweat on Suliem's brow is one backed by all 20 current F1 drivers, so there is a united front with their own respective followings online. So surely the drivers with their own backings on social media, as well as their general stardom with their sponsors, plus all of the journalistic outlets and the news corporations, surely it's going to generate some sort of response from the FIA regarding this. And I'm pretty sure that the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile is going to be really hammering it home, the all-women test they're having in Jarama at the moment regarding Formula E, because yes, that is actually governed by the FIA. And they're hoping that because social media is what it is, that this statement will just go away into the quiet and people will forget about it. And that's not me saying that this all-women Formula E test is something that we shouldn't be paying attention to. We should be. And it's something that I'm really, really proud is a thing, because we can actually see the current talent pool of women drivers, and it also gives Abby Pulling another opportunity before she gets her championship prize of F1 Academy of her getting a seat in GB3, which is British Formula 3. Sure, it's not exactly as prestigious as FRECA, but hey, it's something. I just don't want the FIA to use it as a smokescreen. I just want them to champion it as a legitimate practice. But there is clearly going to be a growing feud between the FIA president and its drivers. And in the middle of all this, we're starting to see an interesting dynamic appear, and one led by 2 drivers in particular, with diametrically opposed ways of getting their points across: George Russell and Max Verstappen. Now, I think it's quite obvious to say that there have been quite a few instances where these 2 men have gone at loggerheads with one another. They are 2 completely different entities. You've got this one guy who's very erudite, very formal, very straight-laced, and then you've got this guy who's a complete firecracker, one of the most talented drivers of this generation, and is not afraid to speak his own mind. I mean, George is not afraid to speak his own mind, but it's done a little bit more politely. But they both get the same result in a way. And also, people are just as impressed with each other in terms of their brazenness and audacity. And of course, their most notable incident was back in Baku that one time when they came in contact, and they had a very heated exchange with one another. But one thing is for sure, they're both unafraid to voice their opinions to all that will listen. I reckon that this entire situation regarding the GPDA now actually gaining some teeth and an actual backbone, and actually having the concerted backing of all of the drivers with George Russell in the lead of all of them, this could be the making of the British driver in trying to re-evaluate his position amongst the fandom and really give people an understanding of who he is like as a person, and that he can be a voice for good and a really good leader at Mercedes when Lewis Hamilton leaves. But the funniest thing I'm just getting out of this is that I think these 2, Max and George, can really make a good double act, a buddy cop movie of sorts. You get George just saying it quite eloquently, saying, I believe we can find a common ground, so that means we can all race together and be absolutely harmonious with each other. That would be absolutely amazing. And then Max is just in the background going, yeah, mate, what he said. But in all seriousness, both George and Max are seeking the same outcome, and that is a clarification of the rules regarding swearing and better transparency within the FIA. It's just that one chooses to be nice about it and one chooses to be violent about it. Both are fascinating and clearly represent the personalities that are fully behind them, and all the drivers are behind both examples. They are in full backing of both Russell and Verstappen. Will this go anywhere? Probably, but I'm not quite sure where. I think at the moment it could go one of three ways. Simply, the first one is that the FIA will just straight up ignore it, just pretend that it hasn't happened, and will use every single good public relations exercise and event to try and just distract and just go, look, we the FIA are really diverse and we're doing all of these good things. We're not just about this one thing, and and then quietly in the background just go, please don't swear, just please don't swear. Or they might actually listen to this statement and take the matter seriously and come up with a really good workaround where instead of actual fines or community service, if a driver does swear in a press conference, they just get a simple warning or they just apologize or something like that, and then the matter is closed. Or the other way, which I think could also happen, is that Mohammed bin Sulayem responds in a way which can actually see the punishments get even worse, or actually just straight up bans or punishments or penalties that we've not even really thought about before. Because do you recall that time a couple of months ago when the FIA went on a blocking spree on social media and then put out a statement saying that the FIA shouldn't be criticised for anything ever? This is just basically the GPDA just going, oh yeah, want to bet? All right, you will put your money where your mouth is. Okay, so the FIA was just criticised by its drivers. Well, what would happen now? Well, for those wondering if Sulayem's job is in danger and that he could be sacked, I don't really see that happening. Because as far as I can recall, there's been no example in recent history or ever of a FISA president or an FIA president or whoever's in charge of Formula One ever being sacked or stepping down before their term is over. Usually a term lasts for 3 years and they can actually run for up to 3 of them. Most of the time, they just choose not to seek re-election and then the matter is closed. With bin Sulayem, the easy answer could be, well, okay, he just won't get re-elected next time. But that being said, though, I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to look at some of the other motorsport governing bodies around the world that might be a little bit more sympathetic toward his own opinions and takes and try and gain some support from them to try and counteract the big motorsport governing bodies who have an equal vote, who will be basically opposed to him and looking for change. It's just quite vague at the moment, so we still got a year to go until the elections happen with the FIA president, so more things can happen, there could be some more controversy, or perhaps some of the big stakeholders of Formula One might just simply go, as the statement said from the GPDA, we don't like what you're doing, so you're not going to contest re-election, Ben, so you go away, quietly retire, these big sponsors will say. Because I think, again, as Lewis said, cash is king. But anyway, that's for next year. Unless the FIA push Ben to retire early, which if they did would be unprecedented, I don't see any change taking place anytime soon. But in any case, the way that George Russell has been addressing this matter is a perfect opportunity for him to act as the main rep of all the drivers, a mantle which he effectively took over from Sebastian Vettel when he retired from F1 and scaled back his involvement with the GPDA to take on other initiatives he wished to champion around the world. But what I really like about this entire story is that this is an opportunity for us to look at George Russell and Max Verstappen and put them on a common level, that they are both fighting for the rights of the Formula One drivers, but they're doing it in different ways for the same endpoint, to allow them the freedom of expression without the fear of impunity. But they do it in their own way, which makes them unique and memorable, and it cements their legacy in the sport for years to come. And they're working together, and I think Russell fans and Verstappen fans will actually look to each other and go, respect. And it's a role that George seemingly is happy to take on. And this could be the perfect opportunity for him to redefine his relationship with the F1 fandom as an advocate for change and the betterment of the sport itself. And as he said in an interview with the Fast and Curious podcast, his end goal is to want the sport to be in the best place possible. That if it's good for the sport, it's good for everyone. I just think this has been a really good opportunity for George to showcase his talents in being able to speak very clearly and strongly as a leader. As in, he knows exactly what he is after, and there is no dilly-dallying or ambiguity, or just being hesitant or something like that. Something, admittedly, that we have seen a lot from the other British driver, not Lewis Hamilton, Lando Norris, and I know that my video from earlier in the week was calling for people to be less critical about him or just to not get towards destructive criticism, but as we have seen this season, he does rely on the pit wall a little bit too much, whereas George Russell, he is very keen to tell the pit wall exactly what he wants to do with his car. And I know that a lot of you out there will simply think that I'm showing British bias, and I know that folks will also be tired of that phrase being thrown around, but I do have to use it as a disclaimer as a Brit. But the fact of the matter is that Russell is a guy who's shown many times that he can make the right call in hindsight. And when it comes to the driving, the Brazilian Grand Prix just went to show that when it comes to wet and tricky conditions, he's right up there with Max in reading the track and keeping it on the black stuff, as well as knowing when the conditions are getting too dangerous and the red flag does need to be called out. And may I remind you, he is quick to call out the FIA for not flying a red flag sooner, because remember back in Melbourne when he got his car tipped and then he could have easily been taken out by another driver if the red flags hadn't been flown that moment? He knows exactly when to call things, and he's not afraid to tell his team and the FIA when to do things. But unfortunately, the way that it's been portrayed in the media with the struggles of Mercedes and of course being the teammate of Lewis Hamilton, so basically the enemy of Lewis Hamilton in some people's views, that it just means that he just comes across as whingy, complaining, lacking personality, and the F1 TV directors simply don't help that, because remember, they're in charge of the team radio that we get in the world feed. So what we do get is media gold for them whenever Russell's on the radio and he's coming up with an idea of going, no, I basically think we should do this option. I believe it's the best thing to do, and I think this could be a really good plan that you should easily take on board. And then the radio just goes, understood, so box, 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 box. And then, as we all remember, in the red flag situation, he basically said to his pit crew, I said it! But he did come up with a nicer explanation later on in the media pen, so let's remember that. And yes, I know, he's not the most naturally charismatic man in the world with his social media posts with Mercedes, them often coming across as very forced, but at least he's willing to give it a go, even if it does result in opinions forming around him that he's basically a PR robot or Woody from Toy Story. This guy can rock a suit though, come on. However, I feel that there have been many instances in his time with Mercedes that have warranted these pushbacks on the radio for him to speak his mind and be frank about not agreeing with what the pit wall says. I can count at least 3 occasions where victory has slipped through George's fingers through something that wasn't his own fault. And I'm more than happy to tell you them. And may I remind you of the first big one, the very first one, Sakir 2020, when he was really running rings around Valtteri Bottas. And I believe that if he had won Sakir, that people's view toward George would be completely different as it is today, because he'd have won in his second season, and that would have been an absolute tour de force, him being the super sub to Lewis Hamilton. And I'm pretty sure that Bottas would have been sacked for 2021, since he was constantly on a 1-year contract. And Toto would have seen it and gone, oh my god, we were actually staring at talent right in front of our eyes. Valtteri, get the heck out of our car. George, you get in the car right now. We need to go against Max and Alex tomorrow. Yes, yes. But then, of course, a pit stop bungle thanks to a radio communication failure, and then a puncture that put paid to any of that. Then, of course, there's Zandvoort 2022, when he was moved to a soft tyre strategy from the lead, and even though he got a podium out of it, he just completely fell to bits and lost the chance for a win, as did Lewis Hamilton that time out as well. He fell down to 4th because of a split strategy. And then Spa just completely showed that when it came to his driving, he was able to keep Lewis behind on weaker tyres, he made the one-stop strategy work, only for the team to admit that they miscalculated the weights on his car, and that got him disqualified. So I feel really, really bad for George. At this point in his career, he could have maybe 5 victories in his pocket, and sure, that's not a huge amount of wins when you compare it to some other drivers, but it's a darn sight more than 2. Let's just say that. Is that it's high time for Mercedes to actually take Russell more seriously and trust in him to be the leader now that he is actually going to be the leader, especially now that Lewis Hamilton's headed to Ferrari and his final races at the moment are not going well for him and bringing out a very dejected and very demoralised Lewis, that's for sure. And also, in the light of Lando Norris's rise to the top and his attempts to thwart Verstappen in his quest for a 4th title, it's also resulted in people maybe looking at George and pulling a Thanos and going, perhaps I treated you too harshly. Because even though I believe that the vitriol toward Lando Norris is really getting out of hand at this point, in some circles it is warranted. And maybe it's starting to change the media perception of George. At least he's not afraid to speak his mind and he does have a clear direction in which to go. It might not work out, but at least he has a plan. Whereas in some circles, people think that Lando just simply doesn't have a plan and he just relies on the pit wall to do everything for him. But that's not an exclusive thing. There are drivers out there that do lean on the pit wall more than they should. And perhaps the way he carries himself as a driver and as leader of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, now that it's actually becoming a legit organisation once more, it might bring in more value amongst the wider F1 world. In the bigger picture, Russell's season has been a unique chance for him to prove himself as a leader both on and off the track. Perhaps Mercedes might finally see him as more than just a secondary driver. He could well be the team's future anchor if they trust him to lead. And even though his perception amongst the media is still a bit fractious and he does come across as whingy sometimes and just a little bit dubious amongst many and thinking that he may not actually have it when it takes to become a world champion, you still got to look at stuff like Brazil and go, you know what? he is actually really good because, as a certain Brazilian driver once said, the water is a great leveler because whilst Verstappen is clearly leading in performance, Russell's strength lies in his capacity to represent drivers' interests with a steady, diplomatic hand. And this season may be less about race wins for the British driver, but it's more about establishing his place in Formula One and how he will be remembered, as the driver who wasn't afraid to go up against Mohammed Ben Sulayem alongside his teammates and colleagues and actually give them what for. Because whether Mercedes chooses to make the most of George's talents or not, I do think that what George is doing right now and this year has actually been really good for him and improving his public image. Because of course, you've only got to look at some other races where he's been able to actually get past Lando Norris and actually take the lead, and actually his starts are really good. Let's remember Spain. He went from 4th to 1st, and that was probably one of the most audacious starts that we'd seen in a long time. He managed to do what Checo couldn't do at Mexico 2023, going from 5th to 1st. He failed to do that. George, he nailed it. So just give him a good car, and I think he could actually be a compelling championship contender in the fullness of time. Certainly, at least amongst the best. But one thing's for sure, I think he might be a pretty good role model for people who are up-and-coming drivers. But let me know in the comments whether or not you actually value George more as a driver, and now he's actually making the GPDA actually be taken seriously. And speaking of a good role model, the quest to be the young sidekick to Max Verstappen in the future wages on with Liam Lawson now potentially being challenged by one Franco Colapinto, albeit for a very, very steep fee if the reports are to be believed. To find out why the Franco hike could actually solve a very major problem with the Red Bull lineup at the moment and make sure they can keep Checo for as long as they can without looking too bad and the bad guys, go and watch this video next, right here. I shall see you there. But for now, I need a bit of a break, so I'm off to Center Parcs for a week. Bye.